The transport ship broke through the planet's upper atmosphere with a trembling roar, its metallic hull scraping against waves of frozen particulate matter suspended in the air. Outside, there was no blue sky or visible horizon, only a blinding field of white that stretched infinitely in every direction, reflecting even the faint light of the distant sun like a mirror. The planet was called Cryos 9, a world so cold and isolated that its surface temperature never rose above -100 degrees Celsius. Every gust of wind carried shards of crystallized moisture sharp enough to cut exposed skin, and every echo disappeared instantly into the storm's endless murmur. The Galactic Academy had chosen it as the proving ground for one of its most feared survival trials. When the ramp of the transport opened, a gust of air so cold it shimmered rushed inside, coating everything with frost. The alien cadets stepped out first, luminous beings with scales, fur, or glistening shells that shimmered under their own biological light. Some emitted soft glows of blue or green from glands in their chests. Others radiated low heat fields that melted the snow beneath their feet. Their forms were adapted to the extremes of their homeworlds, built to endure pressure, cold, or radiation. Yet even they hesitated before stepping into the white abyss that awaited them. Among them stood one figure without any natural adaptation, Lieutenant Aaron Cross, the only human participant. His visor reflected nothing but the swirling snow ahead. Unlike his alien peers, his body generated no light, no shield, no glow, only the faint hum of the oxygen regulator on his chest. The briefing officer, a tall insectoid creature whose carapace glittered with frost, raised his arm to project the holographic map. "The rules are simple," the voice translated through static. "You start here. You finish at the extraction beacon 12 kilometers north. You may not use artificial heat. You may not ignite or generate fire. No flares, no energy signatures, no plasma reactions. You will survive by what you can find, or you will die." The last sentence lingered in the air like a physical object. Then the hologram flickered and vanished, leaving only the moaning wind. Aaron tightened the seals on his suit and stepped onto the surface. His boots sank deep into the powder, releasing muffled crunches with every move. The snow seemed weightless yet infinite, swallowing his legs halfway each time he advanced. The visor's thermal display was useless. Everything ahead registered as the same empty cold, a frozen ocean of static white. Above him, the sky was a solid sheet of swirling mist, and the light filtering through it was harsh and directionless. He couldn't tell where the sun was. In every direction, there was only white. The other cadets scattered in groups, their forms glowing faintly as they moved. The Ethrak, massive reptilian bipeds, used their tails to carve trails through the drifts. The insectoid Thrix climbed over icy ridges, using claws sharp enough to anchor into the frozen crust. The feline Niari vanished quickly into the storm, using their fur membranes as insulation. Aaron watched them disappear one by one until the blizzard swallowed even their light. He was alone within minutes, surrounded by nothing but the sound of his own breathing. He knew the purpose of this trial. It was not about speed, but endurance. The Galactic Academy called it the White Silence, a test designed to strip cadets of every advantage, forcing them to rely on raw intellect and willpower. To the alien species, survival meant exploiting their physiology. To a human, whose entire history depended on mastering fire, it was a cruel irony. He was forbidden from using the very element that defined his species' rise. He began his journey by marking the landing site with a metal pole salvaged from the transport's side rail. He wrapped a rope around his waist and tied it to the pole, giving himself an anchor. In the storm, visibility dropped to less than 2 meters, and without a reference point, a person could walk in circles until exhaustion took them. He took a step forward, then another, feeling the rope pull slightly behind him. He tied knots every few meters, counting under his breath. The silence was overwhelming. No insects, no birds, no mechanical hums, just the low howl of the wind and the occasional sound of snow shifting beneath his feet. Minutes turned to hours. The surface of Cryos 9 was deceptive. It wasn't flat, but full of hidden ridges and sinkholes that lurked beneath thin crusts of ice. More than once, Aaron's leg punched through a layer, sinking knee-deep into slush that instantly froze around his boot. He had to wrench himself free using both arms. The physical strain burned through his energy reserves quickly, and the inside of his visor fogged with each exhale. When he stopped to rest, he realized that his footprints behind him were already gone, erased by the wind within seconds. If not for the rope, he would have lost all sense of direction. At some point, the storm thickened, and the light dimmed until even the ground became indistinguishable from the air. He knelt, touching the snow with his gloved hand. The texture was soft but deceiving. Beneath a thin layer of powder was a solid plate of frozen sediment, compressed snow that had turned into glacial stone. He could feel the vibration of the wind through it, like the pulse of a sleeping animal. It was a living landscape, constantly shifting, breathing, and consuming whatever stood still too long. Aaron activated the temperature log on his wrist unit, minus 95 degrees. His thermal gear had dropped below the minimum safe limit an hour ago. He flexed his fingers to maintain circulation, though he could already feel stiffness creeping in. He knew that once numbness reached his wrists, reaction time would fall drastically. He needed movement to stay alive, but every movement drained strength faster. He wasn't sure how long he could keep it up. Somewhere behind him, a light blinked briefly, a faint flash of blue. One of the alien cadets must have circled back or lost direction. He shouted, but his voice vanished instantly in the wind. The flash appeared again for a moment, then disappeared completely. He stood motionless, staring into the white void, realizing that he was not seeing through snow anymore, but through reflection. The planet's surface acted like a mirror. Every beam of light bounced endlessly between ground and air, scattering into blindness. He couldn't even tell if it was day or night anymore. He thought of Earth. The memory came uninvited, a simple image of a sunlit mountain range where snow looked soft and blue under the morning sky. He remembered how, as a boy, he once held a piece of black volcanic rock in his hand during a trip to Iceland. His father had told him that it was obsidian, a stone formed from cooled lava. "Dark things drink the light," his father had said. "That's why they get warm." The memory felt almost absurd in the middle of this death world, yet it stayed in his mind like a spark refusing to die. He pushed it aside for now, forcing himself to focus on immediate survival. He crouched low and began to build a makeshift barrier of ice blocks using a metal panel from his supply case. He stacked the pieces in a semicircle and crouched behind them, shielding himself from the direct wind. It didn't stop the cold, but it gave his body a chance to rest. The sound changed here. The howling became distant, muffled by the walls he had made. He checked his chronometer. He had covered less than 1 kilometer in 6 hours. The extraction beacon was still 11 kilometers away. The white silence pressed in on him from all sides. Even his thoughts seemed slower, echoing inside his skull like distant voices. He realized then why this trial broke so many cadets. It wasn't the cold. It was the absence of everything. No color, no sound, no direction, no warmth. A sensory void that made the mind collapse in on itself. He forced himself to count again, just to hear something human. 1, 2, 3. His voice cracked in the cold air, and frost gathered around the edges of his microphone. When he tried to stand again, the wind returned, stronger than before. It came in bursts, lifting sheets of snow off the surface and slamming them into his chest plate. His body stumbled, and for a second he thought he was falling through air, but then his knees struck solid ground. He crawled forward, unable to tell if he was even facing north anymore. The compass on his wrist spun uselessly. The planet's magnetic field was chaotic, shifting with each gust. As darkness closed around him, not true darkness, but the dim light of total white, Aaron felt something stirring inside him that wasn't fear, but focus. He had been pushed into the purest form of isolation possible, stripped of every tool except his mind. If he wanted to survive, he needed to think differently. The aliens could rely on biology. He would rely on physics. The world was white because it reflected light. If reflection could be broken, light could be absorbed. And if light could be absorbed, then maybe warmth could exist here, even without fire. He sat in the storm for hours, letting the thought grow inside him like an ember waiting for fuel. The silence no longer felt like an enemy, but a challenge whispering for an answer. Somewhere beneath all this frozen white, he knew, there had to be darkness. Something black enough to drink the light and give it back as heat. He just had to find it. The storm intensified until the world no longer felt solid. The ground, the air, and the sky had merged into a single living force, a white organism of wind and frost that roared endlessly. Aaron moved forward one step at a time, his body bent low as if walking through an invisible ocean. His visor registered nothing but static light. The storm's density confused the sensors and erased all contrast. Each breath turned to ice the moment it left his lips, coating the inside of his helmet with a thin sheen that he had to wipe away every few minutes. He could barely see his own gloved hands. Yet he pressed on because standing still meant freezing to death. Every gust carried shards of frozen air that scraped across his armor like sandpaper. The snow wasn't soft. It was a weapon, shaped into countless microscopic blades by the planet's high winds. Each impact made a faint metallic sound, a cold rainstorm of glass splinters. Aaron's oxygen levels dropped steadily, and he was forced to ration his breathing, taking shallow inhales through clenched teeth. His radio crackled occasionally, fragments of alien speech flickering in and out, but he couldn't make sense of any of it. The others were far ahead or already lost. The storm distorted every transmission, bouncing the signals through the dense clouds like echoes in a cavern. He dragged the rope behind him, the one tied to his starting pole, but he knew it could only help for a while. The line trembled violently in the wind, its fibers freezing solid. If it snapped, he would lose his only link to orientation. He had already counted hundreds of knots, marking each meter, and the thought that he had moved less than a single kilometer gnawed at his patience. The trial demanded progress, but the planet itself wanted to erase all evidence of movement. He stopped for a moment, kneeling in the snow to rest. His arms ached from fighting resistance, and his shoulders burned from the weight of the oxygen pack. The surface beneath him shifted slightly, not from his motion but from the storm itself. The wind carried so much mass that it carved and rebuilt the terrain continuously, turning ridges into valleys and valleys into hills. When he looked up again, the shape of the land had already changed. He could no longer recognize the direction he came from. It was as if the planet was alive, breathing under his feet. Aaron tried to activate his location tracker, but the device displayed only static lines. The magnetic interference of Cryos 9 rendered all instruments unreliable. He was blind, deaf, and nearly numb, guided only by intuition. He remembered the Academy instructor's words, "In this trial, your mind is the only flame you have left." At the time, it had sounded like a poetic warning. Now, it was a desperate truth. The snow pressed against him from all sides, layering upon his shoulders and arms until he felt buried. He brushed it away constantly, though his hands trembled from exhaustion. He knew that if his suit vents clogged, carbon dioxide buildup could kill him before the cold did. His heart pounded heavily in his chest, each beat echoing inside the helmet like the thud of a hammer. It wasn't just the environment attacking him now. It was his own body. As he moved forward, the storm seemed to change texture. It wasn't just a wall of air anymore, but a collection of smaller, faster vortices swirling within it. Tiny whirlwinds collided, creating patterns of motion that felt purposeful. He could feel shifts in pressure, gentle one moment, brutal the next, as though something massive were breathing all around him. He crouched and dug his gloved hand into the snow, trying to anchor himself, but the surface gave way beneath him. He fell forward into a depression filled with powder. The impact knocked the air out of his lungs, and he coughed violently, gasping through the tight filter. For a moment, he considered staying there, curling into the hollow to let the storm pass. But he knew it wouldn't pass. Cryos 9 didn't have weather patterns. It had cycles of death. He crawled out of the depression and stood again, shaking the frost from his visor. The air seemed thicker now, almost gelatinous, every step requiring immense force. He had read that the snow here contained microcrystals of silicate that refracted light in unpredictable ways. The effect was hypnotic. Shadows appeared where none existed, and flashes of brilliance danced like lightning in slow motion. It was easy to lose balance, to mistake light for solid matter. Once or twice, he reached for what seemed like a wall or rock formation, only to grab nothing but air. The planet played tricks on perception, and he realized this was part of the test. The Academy hadn't chosen this place for its hostility alone, but for its ability to dismantle sanity. After several more hours, his limbs felt as heavy as iron. The wind had carved his suit into a dull gray from constant abrasion. He no longer felt his fingers or toes. His internal temperature monitor flashed red, signaling the onset of hypothermia. He needed shelter, but there was nothing except snow and more snow. Still, he refused to stop walking. Every minute he spent moving meant his blood kept circulating, even if weakly. His only advantage over this world was persistence. Suddenly, he saw movement, faint but real. Ahead, through the storm's haze, a silhouette shifted, glowing faintly blue. He recognized the shape immediately. An alien cadet, one of the reptilian Ithrak, crawling slowly across the ground. Aaron called out through the radio, but the signal came back distorted. He waved his arm, trying to get the cadet's attention, but the figure didn't respond. He approached carefully, each step measured. When he finally reached the shape, he froze. The body was half buried in the snow, motionless. The light came from the creature's chest gland, still pulsing weakly, though the cadet's eyes were glassy and unblinking. The body was frozen solid. Aaron stared for a long time before crouching beside it. He touched the armor and felt it crumble beneath his hand. The heat gland flickered once more and went dark. He closed the cadet's eyes and stood in silence. There was no time for mourning, no time for words. He looked at the body and realized how quickly this storm erased everything. In another hour, the alien would be nothing but part of the landscape, buried under a smooth new layer of snow. It was terrifyingly efficient. He turned away and forced himself to move faster. The blizzard grew even thicker as the day, or what he assumed was day, dragged on. The visibility shrank to less than a meter. He extended his gloved hand forward, watching it vanish into the white only inches away. At some point, he realized he could no longer hear his own footsteps. The storm had grown so loud that sound itself seemed to bend. It was like walking through liquid silence, the kind that pressed on the eardrums until it became painful. He shouted just to confirm that his voice still existed. The sound came back immediately, muffled and hollow, as though the air itself were devouring it. He began to lose track of direction again. His compass spun wildly, the digital arrow flickering without rest. He switched it off to save power. It was useless anyway. He had no way to tell where north was. Even the rope line was now so coated in frost that it had become rigid, no longer extending properly. He decided to leave it behind. Carrying it further would only slow him down. He took out his emergency beacon and checked the coordinates. The device barely functioned. Its screen cracked from the cold, but he saw enough to understand that he was only halfway across the planned route. 6 kilometers still lay ahead. At that moment, the storm changed again. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed. A sudden blast hit him from the left, throwing him sideways into the snow. He rolled, his body sliding several meters before stopping against an invisible ridge. The impact knocked his visor against the helmet frame, cracking the lower corner. He cursed under his breath and pressed his hand against it to prevent more heat from escaping. His breathing quickened, fog filling the interior once again. The world became a flickering dance of light and shadow. It was then that he noticed something new, something dark, faintly visible through the snow. It wasn't a shadow, but a patch of ground that absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. It looked wrong in this endless whiteness, like a hole torn in the storm. He crouched near it, brushing away the snow, revealing a chunk of stone, black, glassy, and sharp-edged. It glistened faintly under the filtered light. He ran his hand across it and felt a trace of warmth, impossibly faint but unmistakable. The realization sent a jolt through his mind. He didn't yet understand how it could help him, but he knew it meant something. The memory of his father's words about black rock drinking light surfaced once more, this time clear and deliberate. He chipped away a few fragments and placed them in his pouch. He would test them later when the storm eased. For now, he resumed walking, but the discovery had shifted something inside him. For the first time since landing, he felt curiosity instead of despair. The blizzard might blind his eyes, but his mind had found something solid to hold on to, a problem to solve, a reason to move forward. Hours later, when the storm reached its peak, Aaron stopped again, standing atop a ridge where the wind's force was strong enough to nearly lift him. He looked out into the endless field of white, imagining the extraction beacon hidden somewhere beyond sight. Around him, the blizzard continued to dance like a living creature, ruthless, sentient, devouring. Yet beneath all that chaos, beneath the frozen crust and blinding light, he knew there was darkness waiting. Black rock sleeping under the ice. The only thing on this world that could consume light instead of being destroyed by it. He clenched his fists and whispered to himself, "If white kills, then black will save." Then he pushed forward again into the storm, leaving behind the body of the fallen alien and the rope that tied him to the start. By the time the storm's pulse began to slow, Aaron could barely lift his legs. His muscles ached with every step, and his breath came in slow, painful gasps. The air tasted metallic inside the helmet, the recycled oxygen sharp in his throat. The wind had weakened just enough for the horizon to appear again, a dim gray line that separated the sky from the endless white beneath it. For the first time in what felt like days, he could see farther than a few meters. The silence after the blizzard was strange, unnatural, like the planet itself was holding its breath. The snow under his boots no longer shifted violently, but it still whispered faintly, as if alive. He stopped walking and looked down. In the smooth field before him, the wind had carved patterns, waves, circles, long fractures that shimmered faintly with trapped ice crystals. He knelt beside one of the cracks and noticed something dark glinting at the bottom. He brushed the snow away, fingers stiff and barely responsive, until the surface below revealed itself. There, half buried in frost, was the same type of black stone he had seen before, the one that had absorbed light instead of reflecting it. It was smooth and cold, but unlike the surrounding ice, it did not reflect white. Instead, it seemed to swallow color entirely. The snow around its edges melted slightly, forming a ring of slush. He placed his gloved hand on the stone and felt an unmistakable difference, faint warmth radiating upward. It wasn't heat in the ordinary sense. It was more like the absence of cold. The stone retained the energy from the dim sunlight breaking weakly through the cloud cover. Aaron realized he was kneeling atop something ancient. The fragments were not isolated. They were part of a massive layer beneath the ice, a buried field of volcanic debris from a time when this frozen world had once burned. He took out a small metal probe from his belt and struck the ground gently. The sound was dull, like knocking on solid glass. The planet's crust here was thin enough for remnants of the old magma flow to be close to the surface. He knew that if he could expose enough of those rocks, their dark surface would absorb what little light the sun offered, and that energy might be enough to weaken the ice. He began to dig. Each motion was slow, deliberate, and exhausting. His hands trembled, and the shovel in his grip felt heavier with every strike. He removed layer after layer of compacted snow, forming a pit about 1/2 meter deep. The deeper he went, the darker the material became until the white faded entirely and the black volcanic layer revealed itself fully. When he stepped back to observe it, the sight was almost alien, a scar of shadow on the endless white, glimmering faintly as the light above struck it. A single beam of weak sunlight pierced through the clouds and landed directly on the exposed rock. Within minutes, the surrounding snow began to glisten, then melt, tiny droplets forming on the edges. It was working. Slowly, but undeniably, the black surface was drinking the light and releasing warmth. Aaron crouched and placed his gloved hand near it. The temperature here was several degrees higher than the surrounding snow. Not enough to sustain life, but enough to alter the environment. He began marking a path with pieces of the stone, digging and arranging them in a rough line ahead of him. Each fragment acted as a heat source, absorbing light during the rare moments when the storm cleared, then releasing it gradually. The snow around each piece began to collapse slightly, forming shallow trenches. He realized that if he continued this process, he could create a visible trail, a dark corridor through the blinding white. The melted snow would compact into slush, and when it refroze, it would form a hard crust, stable enough to walk on. That would make movement easier and faster. He would no longer sink knee-deep into powder with every step. The idea ignited something inside him, a spark of determination he hadn't felt since the trial began. The planet wasn't just trying to kill him. It was also offering him the tools to survive, hidden beneath its surface. He filled his pouch with more fragments and continued forward, repeating the process every few meters. His motions became rhythmic. Dig, expose, break, arrange. Each section of dark stone ate away at the whiteness. As the sun briefly appeared again, a faint shimmer of steam rose from the melting points, curling upward like thin smoke. It was the closest thing to warmth he had seen since landing on Krios 9. The effect mesmerized him, the contrast between light and shadow, between deathly cold and subtle heat. In that hostile landscape, his human instinct for fire had found a new form. Hours passed. The pale light shifted slightly, suggesting the approach of night, though the planet's rotation was slow enough that dusk might last for hours. The shadows grew longer, and the temperature dropped again. Yet his trail remained faintly visible, a line of black cuts across the frozen plain. He followed it carefully, stopping only when his limbs screamed for rest. He built a small shelter using slabs of compact ice and crouched inside, watching the faint glow of condensation rise from his newly formed path. The snow outside hissed softly as it met the warmth from the black stones. As he sat there, he thought about the other cadets. He hadn't seen another living soul since he found the frozen Yithrak. He suspected most had either perished or turned back. The Academy's record stated that fewer than 20% of participants ever completed the White Silence trial, and even fewer did it without mechanical assistance. He wondered briefly what the instructors were thinking as they monitored him from orbit. Perhaps they assumed he was dead too. But humans had always thrived on being underestimated. His wrist display flickered, battery reserves at 30%. He needed to conserve energy. Every tool, every sensor, every light consumed precious power. He shut off non-essential systems and relied on the faint daylight for navigation. His body was growing weaker, his movements slower, but his mind had found a rhythm. He began to calculate distances using memory alone, estimating how far he could travel before needing rest again. The dark stones gave him a visual pattern to follow, an artificial direction in a world that had none. The next morning, if such a term could apply here, he woke to a strange sight. Overnight, the air had frozen into vertical sheets, thin curtains of frost that hung between ridges, shimmering like glass walls. His dark pathway cut through them, a jagged scar of melted clarity in the middle of the white. He stood for a long moment, mesmerized by how alien and beautiful it looked. The trail almost resembled an artery, pulsating faintly with vapor. It wasn't just a tool anymore. It was a living structure. The world itself seemed to respond to his actions, reshaping under the influence of contrast. He continued forward, expanding his creation. Each time he uncovered a new deposit of black rock, he widened the path, connecting one heated patch to another. Soon the segments formed a continuous chain, a corridor of faint warmth and dark color slicing through the wilderness. The more he built, the easier his breathing became. His legs no longer sank as deeply. The icy wind still tore at him, but he could now move faster, using the solidified track as both direction and defense. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of motion in the distance, flickers of blue or green light, perhaps remnants of alien technology or dying cadets. But he no longer chased them. He had learned that chasing illusions only led to death. Instead, he focused on his tangible creation, the physics of survival, the proof of human ingenuity in the middle of oblivion. He stopped once to collect a large, flat stone, blacker and smoother than the others. When he tilted it against the sun's weak rays, it shimmered like obsidian glass. He placed it near the entrance of his latest shelter, where it would absorb as much light as possible. Then, using the blade of his knife, he scratched a single line across its surface, an improvised mark, not of vanity, but of existence. It was the first human trace ever carved into Cryos 9's frozen skin. As he moved on, a thought came to him, an understanding that the world itself wasn't hostile out of cruelty. It was simply indifferent. The difference between life and death here depended entirely on awareness. The aliens had relied on their biology, but biology obeyed instinct. Instinct could not adapt fast enough to a world that demanded thought. Humans were fragile, yes, but fragility forced evolution of mind. Fire, shelter, strategy. Those were human inventions. And now, even without fire, he had found another way to create warmth. The storm began to stir again, faintly rumbling at the edge of the horizon. He knew another cycle was coming, perhaps stronger than the last. But this time, he wasn't afraid. He had prepared a network of heat patches connected by solid trails. If he timed it right, the black stones would continue absorbing light during the few calm hours and retain enough warmth to keep the pathways from closing completely when the next blizzard hit. He knelt once more, pressing his gloved palm against one of the rocks. Beneath his hand, he could feel it, real warmth, however slight. It pulsed faintly, alive in its own quiet way. He smiled inside his frost-covered helmet. The path ahead was still long, the extraction beacon still far beyond the visible horizon, but he had something the others didn't: a method, a rhythm, and the proof that thought could change even the coldest world. He adjusted his pack, tightened his gloves, and continued forward along the black trail he had created, a thin thread of darkness cutting through the blinding snow. The storm returned with a vengeance. Aaron could see it forming hours before it reached him, a dense curtain of moving ice spreading across the horizon like a living wall. The pale light dimmed again, replaced by the swirling gray mass that devoured the landscape ahead. He didn't stop working. The black stones were doing their job, slowly cutting a scar through the white, but he needed to strengthen the path before the blizzard consumed it again. The wind's roar grew louder, a deep pulse echoing through the ground. The planet was preparing to erase everything he had built. He hurried along his trail, his movements faster now, his exhaustion masked by urgency. He broke more fragments from the buried volcanic layer and threw them ahead in irregular intervals. Each dark shard seemed to hum faintly under his boots, radiating the warmth it had gathered from the last hours of dim sunlight. He knew that if the storm buried these markers too deeply, the heat would still leak through, forming weak air pockets beneath the snow. That meant survival, not comfort, but life. When the first gusts hit him, he crouched low and covered his helmet with his arm. The blizzard descended like a physical wave, pushing him sideways and flattening the path behind him. He tried to stay close to the line of dark stones, using them as invisible rails. Every few meters he dropped another fragment, pressing it into the slush with his boot. The air howled around him, erasing sound, erasing shape. It was like walking through the lungs of a dying god. He reached the first intersection of his network. where 3 trails of dark stone converged. The surface there shimmered faintly, steam rising in thin ribbons that twisted through the wind before freezing mid-air. The melted snow refroze almost instantly, creating translucent shells that cracked under his weight. He moved carefully, crouching low, letting the storm flow over him instead of fighting it. The idea of resistance felt pointless here. Survival wasn't about overpowering nature, but aligning with it. He found a narrow crevice between 2 ice ridges and decided to rest. He dug quickly, using his shovel to carve an entrance just large enough for his body. Inside, he reinforced the walls with compacted snow, pressing them tight until they hardened into ice. Then, he took several black stones and arranged them along the floor in a semicircle, like a primitive campfire. The rocks absorbed the faint heat radiating from his body and began to warm the small space slightly. It wasn't enough to melt the air inside, but it slowed the freezing of his breath on the helmet's glass. For the first time in days, he could rest without shaking uncontrollably. He turned off all external lights and stared into the faint glow of condensation rising from the floor. Outside, the storm screamed endlessly. The sound was both terrifying and hypnotic. It reminded him of the ocean during a storm on Earth, limitless, merciless, yet strangely alive. The longer he listened, the more it sounded like a voice, deep and constant, calling from beneath the ice. He forced his mind away from hallucinations. Exhaustion could twist perception, and the last thing he needed was to lose focus now. Hours passed before he moved again. The storm hadn't stopped, but his internal chronometer indicated that the worst of it was over. The wind had dropped slightly, though visibility was still non-existent. He crawled out of his shelter and immediately felt the pressure of the storm pressing against him. The black stones were still visible beneath a thin crust of snow, glowing faintly like coals under ash. The line was alive. He began walking again, slower this time, following the faint warmth underfoot. Every step was guided by touch, not sight. He learned to feel the difference, the subtle vibration of solidified crust where snow had melted and refrozen, the softer texture of untouched powder. At some point during the march, his boot hit something metallic. He stopped, crouched, and brushed the surface. A broken beacon half buried in the snow, a marker from another cadet's equipment, perhaps lost during the previous trial. The antenna was snapped, and the transmitter's light was dark. He picked it up and turned it in his hand. The screen was frozen, the circuits dead. Still, it reminded him that others had been here before him, perhaps years ago. The planet had no mercy. Every trace of failure was buried beneath new snow, erased by time and wind. He felt a strange mix of respect and defiance. The dead had become part of this place, but he would not. He continued walking, his senses attuned to the sound of the snow beneath him. Each crunch, each vibration told him something. The rhythm of his steps became a mantra, keeping his thoughts from dissolving into the storm's chaos. Then, suddenly, the ground dropped. The crust cracked beneath his left foot, and he fell half a meter into an air pocket. His knee struck ice, sending pain shooting through his leg. He cursed, gritting his teeth, and looked down. The black stones he had laid earlier had done their job too well. The heat they emitted had created hollow spaces under the snow, small tunnels where meltwater had refrozen into glassy sheets. He realized something then. Those hollow tunnels could be useful. They acted as insulation pockets, warmer than the open air. If he could connect them, he could crawl through during storms, shielded from the direct wind. The idea was risky, but brilliant. He began to dig, following the hollow channel downward, widening it enough for his body to slide through. Inside, the air was heavy but still breathable. The walls glistened, reflecting the faint light from his wrist display. It was like crawling through a frozen lung, beautiful and terrifying. He moved forward, guided by touch alone. The tunnel occasionally widened, allowing him to kneel, then narrowed again until he had to push through sideways. The heat from the black stones above and around him maintained a fragile balance. The tunnel didn't collapse, but small droplets of melted frost dripped from the ceiling, freezing instantly upon touching his suit. Every meter forward was a victory. When he finally emerged from the tunnel, he found himself at the base of a massive ridge. The ridge towered above him like a wall of glass, its surface rippled by centuries of wind. Light filtered through it, refracted into faint blue hues. He could see his own reflection in the ice, pale, skeletal, almost ghost-like. He stared at it for a moment and then began to climb. His gloves and boots dug into the ridges, cracking the surface slightly with each pull. The climb was slow, methodical, and silent. Halfway up, he paused to catch his breath and looked down. His black trail snaked behind him like an open wound in the snow, steaming faintly even from this height. It was beautiful in its defiance. When he reached the top, the landscape opened before him, vast, endless, almost luminous under the pale light. The storm clouds began to part, revealing a thin slice of sun on the horizon. The rays struck the surface of his trail, causing steam to rise once more. The view was surreal, thin lines of dark, winding corridors glowing faintly as they absorbed sunlight, cutting through the planet's skin like veins of life. He realized that he had created something more than a survival path. It was a system, a network of warmth that interacted with the environment. The heat from one section spread beneath the surface, feeding the next, slowly altering the texture of the ice. He was changing the planet without meaning to. He knelt and touched the ice at the top of the ridge. The vibration felt different now, softer, more fluid. He had disturbed a balance that had been frozen for millennia. He didn't know whether it was dangerous or not, but for the first time, he felt like the world was responding to him. It was no longer a silent adversary. It was listening. The wind began to shift again, gentler now, flowing in new directions through the valleys he had carved. The snow seemed to move around the black stones rather than bury them. The trails were self-preserving. Each piece of obsidian-like rock created a microclimate, melting and refreezing in cycles that reinforced the structure. He had built an ecosystem of warmth out of nothing. Aaron continued walking along the ridge, mapping the landscape mentally. He marked each major curve in his head, each potential junction where he could expand the network if he survived the next day. The extraction beacon was still far to the north, but he could sense it was no longer an unreachable dream. He was moving faster now, conserving energy through his newly formed corridors, navigating not with instruments, but with instinct and observation. When the light began to fade again, he stopped to rest at the edge of a wide plateau. Below him stretched the trail, long, winding, and alive with faint movement as the steam danced above it. The blizzard behind him was dying, its force broken by the very system he had created. The darkness he had brought into the white silence had turned into a tool of survival, and with it, he had outlasted both the storm and the death that had claimed everyone else. He sat down on a block of ice, staring into the endless distance. The cold no longer felt like an enemy, but like a familiar presence. The air was still sharp and thin, but he had learned to move with it, to breathe through its rhythm. The black stones glowed faintly below him, their surfaces slick with melting frost. They reminded him of fire, not flame, but its essence. Humanity's oldest ally reborn in a world where fire could not exist. He leaned back against the ridge and allowed himself a moment of stillness. His vision blurred slightly from exhaustion, but his thoughts were clear. The survival of his species had never depended on strength or adaptation. It had always depended on invention. The universe could throw any condition at a human being: cold, heat, radiation, emptiness, and somewhere, somehow, he would find a way to shape it into something livable. As the faint steam rose and vanished into the gray air, Aaron smiled faintly beneath his frost-covered visor. He had made warmth from shadow. He had turned the coldest place in the galaxy into proof that thought itself was the final flame. The following day began with silence, not the suffocating stillness of the first hours after landing, but a softer, almost reverent quiet. The wind had stopped. The clouds had thinned to translucent layers of silver mist, and a pale sun floated low over the horizon, spilling a diffused, ghostly light across the endless plain. Aaron stood at the edge of the ridge he had slept upon, watching the frozen world breathe beneath him. The black pathways he had carved through the snow stretched far into the distance, winding like veins through a living body. Steam still drifted lazily upward from sections where the obsidian stones had absorbed sunlight, creating pockets of motion in the otherwise motionless expanse. He had transformed the landscape, and the planet, in its own strange way, acknowledged it. His body ached from exhaustion, but he felt strangely light. The pain no longer controlled him. It simply existed alongside him, a constant companion. His oxygen gauge had dropped into the final quarter, and the water recycler in his suit sputtered occasionally, warning of low reserves. He knew that he would not last another storm, but that no longer mattered. The extraction beacon was still out there, faint and distant, but reachable. He could almost feel its signal humming faintly through the air, a steady pulse somewhere beyond the next ridge. It had become less a destination and more a promise, a symbol of what he had already accomplished. He began to walk again, each step deliberate and rhythmic. His boots no longer sank deeply into the snow. The hardened black crust beneath him carried his weight easily. The trail he had built had evolved, solidified through countless freeze-melt cycles into something more stable than he had expected. The black rocks continued to work even without direct sunlight, storing and slowly releasing absorbed energy. Every few meters he could feel faint warmth rising through the soles of his boots. It wasn't enough to comfort, but it was enough to move forward. The terrain changed gradually as he advanced. The plain gave way to subtle slopes, where thin layers of ice reflected fragments of light in shifting colors. He noticed that some of the air ducts he had crawled through during the last storm had collapsed and refrozen, forming translucent tunnels that glowed faintly blue from captured light. The world was reshaping itself around his intervention, as though the planet's frozen ecosystem had incorporated his invention into its own rhythm. It no longer rejected his presence. The white silence had turned into a mosaic of dark veins and luminous corridors, a dialogue between heat and cold. He stopped for a moment and turned back. From this height, he could see the full scale of what he had created. The black trails connected into a branching pattern, each fork merging with another, forming something that looked eerily like a nervous system spread across the landscape. It reminded him of human anatomy, arteries feeding warmth through a frozen organism. A faint smile touched his face. He hadn't planned for this. He had only wanted to survive, but his survival had rewritten part of a world. A faint crackling interrupted his thoughts. His radio receiver flickered to life for the first time in days. Static filled his helmet, followed by a broken voice. Survivor detected, signal trace found, then silence again. He adjusted the frequency manually, tapping the controls until the signal strengthened. Lieutenant Cross, if you read this, respond. The voice was clear now, metallic and distant, but undeniably human. His pulse quickened. He pressed the transmitter button and spoke, his voice rough and weak. Cross reporting, alive, coordinates uncertain, following path north toward beacon. The line went quiet for a few seconds, then came the reply. Acknowledged. We have your thermal trace. Stay on your current course. Extraction drones inbound. ETA, 6 hours. 6 hours. It sounded impossible and yet perfectly within reach. He looked up at the sun, its weak rays filtering through crystalline air. 6 hours in this stillness felt eternal, but he had endured worse. He turned his attention back to the horizon and continued walking, following the trail of melted snow and black stone that glowed faintly beneath his feet. The hours crawled by. The light shifted gradually from silver to a faint golden hue, filtered through high clouds. His pace slowed, his breathing shallow, but he did not stop. The radio remained silent, except for an occasional flicker of static. He counted his steps, not in numbers but in breaths, measuring distance by endurance. At some point, he began to hear faint vibrations beneath the ice, the sound of engines, mechanical and rhythmic. He looked up and saw them, dark specks cutting through the sky above the horizon, moving with precision and speed. The drones. He wanted to signal them, but his arm felt heavy. The energy reserves in his suit had dropped too low for the beacon to transmit automatically. He stumbled forward, searching for higher ground. The ridge ahead gleamed faintly, coated with ice so smooth it reflected the pale sky. He climbed it slowly, using both hands, his gloves cracking from the frost. At the top, he took one of the black stones from his pack and lifted it toward the sunlight. It absorbed the light instantly, its surface glimmering like molten glass. He dropped it onto the snow, where it began to steam and spread a faint circle of vapor. He added another and another until a small cluster of dark smoke rose into the air, a signal born not from fire, but from absorption, a man-made shadow visible in a world of white. The drones saw it. He could tell by the change in their trajectory. They adjusted course, descending rapidly. The wind from their rotors swept across the ridge, stirring the loose frost into spirals. One of the drones hovered directly above him, projecting a scanning beam that passed over his body in a grid of blue light. "Life signs confirmed," a voice transmitted through the shared channel. "Subject identified as human male, Lieutenant Aaron Cross, initiating retrieval." He wanted to respond, but his voice refused to form words. The exhaustion had consumed everything. The drone extended a harness from beneath its chassis, lowering it toward him. He reached for it weakly, managing to lock the hooks around his suit. The machine lifted him gently, carrying him upward into the open air. As he ascended, he looked down one final time at the planet's surface. The black trails stretched endlessly, glowing faintly in the sun. For a moment, they resembled rivers of obsidian cutting through a sea of light. Steam continued to rise from their intersections, like breath from a living creature. It was no longer just a survival route. It was a signature, a human trace carved into a hostile world. The transport ship appeared above the storm's remnants, its hull gleaming faintly in the sunlight. The drone carried him inside through the lower hatch, where warmth enveloped him instantly. The sudden change in temperature made him dizzy. His visor fogged over as he collapsed onto the deck. Hands reached out to pull him into the medical unit, and the hiss of pressurized air filled the chamber. A medic's voice echoed faintly through the haze. "We thought no one would make it. You did the impossible." He tried to answer, but could only manage a hoarse whisper. "Not impossible. Just physics." He lost consciousness shortly after, the warmth consuming the last fragments of his awareness. When he woke again, hours later, he was lying in a narrow cabin. The ship's engines hummed softly in the background. His body was wrapped in thermal layers, his skin still tingling from heat restoration therapy. The medical officer was sitting nearby, checking the monitors. "You stabilized," she said quietly. "We retrieved your trail data. The instructors are calling it the thermal shadow path. You melted half a valley with rocks and sunlight." Her tone held disbelief and awe in equal measure. Aaron sat up slowly, his muscles trembling. Through the small observation window, he could see Cryos 9 shrinking in the distance. The black lines he had created were still visible, faint and branching like veins across the white crust. He felt no pride, only a deep, quiet understanding. What he had done wasn't just a victory, it was a demonstration. Survival was not strength, it was adaptation through knowledge. He had faced a planet designed to kill life and had taught it to yield, if only slightly. The instructor's voice came over the ship's intercom. "Lieutenant Cross, you've completed the White Silence trial. No human or any species has ever reached extraction by natural means. You've given us a new method and a new perspective. The Academy salutes you." He didn't respond. He leaned back, eyes half closed, and listened to the low hum of the engines. His body was exhausted, but his mind was clear. He imagined future cadets walking across Cryos 9, following black trails of stone, guided by warmth born of darkness. The world would remember this pattern, the line between white and black, between death and persistence. As the ship moved farther from the planet, sunlight reflected across its surface, and for a moment he saw the dark paths shimmer like ink veins pulsing through frost. That image stayed with him long after the planet vanished from view. It was not triumph he felt, but reverence, for the cold, for the silence, and for the simple truth that even in the deepest void, a human being could still find a way to create warmth. The Academy archives would later record the method under a new classification: thermal shadow navigation, cross protocol. Future cadets would study it, replicate it, and walk those same black corridors under new suns. But for Aaron, it would always remain something simpler, a proof of existence. He had left behind a mark that no storm could erase, a dark signature of will carved into a world of light. And as he drifted into sleep, surrounded by the quiet hum of the ship, one final thought crossed his mind: that even in the coldest silence of the universe, the trace of a single human mind could burn brighter than any sun.